I'm often asked, what is a blocking bet? And more importantly, how do you use that play effectively in order to win money at the poker table? So let's discuss that today. A blocking bet is essentially a tiny bet made on the river. That's specifically what we're going to be discussing today. And when I say tiny, I mean something like 1/20th of the pot or 1/10 of the pot, or the minimum if the pot is, let's say, 5 big blinds, it'd be 1 big blind. You may ask, why would you want to make that? And we need to look at this from 2 points of view. Let's look at it from an exploitative point of view, where you're trying to take advantage of a mistake your opponent's likely to make, and then we'll look at it from a game theory optimal point of view. Exploitatively, you want to make abnormal bets when you expect your opponent is going to play poorly against them. So let's say you find yourself on the river, out of position with a hand like middle pair, and you think that if I bet minimum, my opponent will call with a lot of top pairs, a lot of middle pairs, a lot of bottom pairs, and you think that they will never bluff you, because that's just how your particular bad opponent plays. If that's the case, betting minimum on the river with a hand like that could be quite strong, because now if you check and your opponent blasts it, which they may do if you check, well, if you bet minimum, you don't ever get bluffed, which is fantastic. Also, if you check and your opponent has bottom pair, they may never value bet it, but if you bet 1 big blind, they may call you, so you get a little bit of value. If they happen to have top pair, if you were to have checked and your opponent would have bet, maybe you end up making a call and you end up losing far more value. So in that scenario, making a tiny bet on the river may make sense. The problem with all exploitative plays, though, is that it's very difficult to know specifically what your opponent does incorrectly. Now, I will say a good spot that I often use a blocking bet is when I really want to get raised on the river by a very obviously loose, aggressive, battling opponent. Let's say I find myself on the river with that same middle pair on the river. I know that if I check, my opponent's going to play decently well. But what if I think on the river instead, if I bet minimum, my opponent's going to take all of his hands that cannot win at the showdown and will then put in a giant raise? Well, if I check my opponent bets, I'm not really winning much EV because they're going to play well, not winning much equity, they're going to not screw up. But if I bet minimum, if they're going to drastically overbluff, well, now I can take this junky middle pair, bet minimum, get raised, and know that I've induced a ton of bluffs. And if I've induced a ton of bluffs, I have a super easy call. And that can result in me now getting a lot of money in very, very well and very profitably with middle pair, which could be very, very nice. These plays are especially good against players who have studied some, who like trying to push around their opponents, and who think that small bets must indicate weakness. Some people think that, some people don't. Again, making very clearly exploitative plays profitably is very difficult because it's hard to read your opponent's mind, but sometimes you can. Let's talk about blocking bets from a game theory optimal point of view. You really only want to make tiny bets when you are out of position, usually when it goes check, check on the turn. Okay? If you're in position, very rarely are you going to want to bet tiny because that reopens the betting action. When you're out of position, though, your opponent's always going to be able to reopen the action or open the action on when they're in position, right? So if you are on the river out of position, if you check, your opponent always has a chance to bet. But if you're in position, if your opponent checks and you check it back, you just get to see the showdown. And for that reason, when you are in position on the river, you basically never want to use a tiny bet from a game theory optimal point of view. You're either going to want to bet medium, like half pot, big, like pot, or really big, like over pot. So in position, you're basically never betting tiny. From out of position, though, when it goes check, check on the turn, you're often going to want to have multiple bet sizes on the river. Usually a tiny bet size, a medium bet size like half pot, and then a big bet size like pot. And your tiny bet size is mostly going to be used with very marginal made hands. These are going to be hands like middle pair, bad kicker, maybe bottom pair, maybe marginal under pairs. Hands that really do not want to check and face a bet. So something like 80 or 85% of your range in this scenario should be clear marginal made hands, some of which are going to call a raise if your opponent does put in a raise. Usually the hands that are going to call the raise have a good blocker to the effective nut type hands that make it more difficult for the opponent to have a really strong hand and therefore more likely that they are bluffing if they're playing well. Again, we're talking game theory optimal world here. A lot of people do not play well against tiny bets. Most people call too often and don't raise enough. But anyway, most of your small bets on the river will be for thin value with middle pair, bottom pair, stuff like that. They can still get called by some worse hands. I'll give you an example of this. The other day, in the World Series of Poker main event, someone raised, I called from the big blind with 7-6 offsuit. Okay, flop comes 10, 6, 2. It goes, I check, he continuation bets, medium, I call with middle pair. Turns an 8. I check, he checks it back. River's another 8. I think this is a nice spot to go for a tiny bet with my, effectively, third pair, middle pair, right? So I bet minimum, he quickly called, and I won the pot. That's the spot where if I check the river and he blast it, it's a pretty bad spot for me. If I check the river and he checks behind, I almost have the best hand and lose a little bit of value. And if he does happen to have me beat with, let's say, top pair, he may just call, fearing that I have 3 of a kind every once in a while, or straight every once in a while. So that's a good spot to go for it with those marginal made hands. Now, remember I said 80 to 85% of your range should be those marginal made hands. The other 15% or so of the time should be something like 10% super nut hands. Really, 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 really good hands that can very clearly bet and then maybe even re-raise if your opponent does put in a raise. That way, your range is not all very clearly marginal hands. And then you also get to bluff every once in a while. Something like 5 to 7% of your range should be garbage bluffs. Now you may say, isn't my opponent going to call my tiny bet on the river every time? Why would I ever bluff? Well, they're not going to call you every single time. I mean, imagine they have something like jack high. They're not going to call with jack high on the river. And by using that range composition of a little bit super nuts, a lot of marginal made hands, and a little bit of bluffs, you get to profit with some bluffs that you may not otherwise be able to profit with. So that's how you use a blocking bet in game theory optimal world. From out of position, tiny bet with a lot of marginal made hands that are pretty weak, a little bit of bluffs, a little bit more nuts, and that's going to make you very, very difficult to play against. So that's me for today. I hope this video was enlightening, educational, and I hope you learned to make blocking bets better. Implement them into your game. If you have any questions, post a hand below in the comment section, and I or somebody else will take a look and give you thoughts about it. Good luck in your games. Have fun. If you enjoyed this video, click the like and subscribe buttons below. Also, click that notification bell, wherever it is, down there, somewhere down there. Run hot. Goodbye.